Politics. Go. Hello and welcome to the Agora Politics podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Matthew Pirkowski. Matt, welcome to the show.
Alex, good to be here.
Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. So for those of you who maybe aren't denizens of Twitter like Matt and I, Matt is a very well-known, I'll just say denizen of Twitter himself, although he has, his own substantial, I'd say, career as well as academic background that backs a lot of the things that he says that people find to be very interesting and very provocative and very enlightening. But I am just going to let the man introduce himself here. And Matt, if you would please just tell us a little bit about who you are, how you view yourself in the current intellectual space, and maybe a little bit about your background and who some of your main intellectual influences are.
Sure, yeah, no problem. It's a little bit of a journey, but at a high level, I've always been extremely curious in terms of understanding the deeper influences that govern and constrain and give rise to human behavior in all of its facets. And that early in my life led me to studying evolutionary psychology. So back in my undergraduate days, I was at Yale and I was at their comparative cognition laboratory, studying primate behavior there, trying to understand the trading behaviors and evolutionary aspects of what is typically considered quote unquote irrational human behavior in the economic domain. So the evolutionary psychology of economics, game theory, did some agent-based modeling at that point in time as well, which got me into complexity science, trying to understand systems from a perspective that is quite novel, still hasn't really penetrated the mainstream in terms of understanding the bottom-up interaction of relatively simple agents and the complex phenomenon that emerged from that. That led me into a career in software engineering. Had to pay the bills for a while, decided to go that route over academia. I think I'm somewhat of a canary in the coal mine in terms of my disagreeableness and the fact that I kind of felt something in the air in terms of a closing of the acceptable intellectual surface area of exploration in academia, even back then, which was around 2008. Decided to go into technology for a while. Worked for a few different places. Most notably, your audience would be familiar with Netflix. I was on a team that was basically responsible for developing all the UIs that go out onto embedded devices, as well as your TV, the things you would watch in your living room. And then, the second half of my time there, I was working quite extensively on trying to understand what the future of that market would look like, what the future of that technology would look like, trying to understand what it means more deeply to innovate with respect to content experience, leveraging sort of the psychological and design background there. Went out on my own, started doing consulting after a little bit of a time in the startup world as well, around 2016. That took me around the world, spent a lot of time in China at that point in time. I don't talk too much about that work. Got a lot of perspective through that work, but yeah, what I was doing is a little bit, it's not something I talk about too much, but it was in the technology space. I went in with very wide eyes, very positive about relations between the United States and China in terms of what could be accomplished through business partnerships and hopefully trying to create a vision for the shared future there. And after a couple of years or 2-3 years of exposure along that front, my perspectives changed quite significantly, or evolved, let's say. During this period as well, I was very interested in cryptocurrencies. I've been interested in Bitcoin since its emergence in 2008, 2009. I didn't buy in until a little bit later, but that's also been a pretty large part of my world over the past few years, trying to understand the way that we represent value as humans, trying to understand how that intersects with my earlier research on what is considered quote unquote rational or irrational human behavior, the limits or capacities of how we represent value and how that changes the way that we are able to build structures of varied complexity atop those fundamental tools we use for representing value. And that kind of outlines or traces some of my current interests. In terms of influences, contemporary influences or past influences, it's hard to say exactly what those are because they kind of range. But somebody who I think is dramatically or woefully underrated and who's a huge influence on me that I would like to perhaps upregulate in the popular consciousness is a guy by the name of Stuart Kauffman. He's a theoretical biologist, a really brilliant mind. He wrote this book called The Origins of Order, which is his initial magnum opus. I would say, I think a bunch of his research into theoretical biology and various models that could be used to probe and explore the landscape of emergent complexity and evolution. I think those models were way ahead of their time. I think they have a lot to say about our current state of reality, especially when you try to incorporate the effects of diffuse changes such as the addition of a layer like the internet into our culture and society. So he's a big influence. I've been a student of philosophy my whole life, so you could basically say any major philosopher in the canon is an influence in their own right upon my thinking. Generally speaking, a little bit, I don't know. People like Darwin as well made a large initial impact. For a while there, I was also sort of quite intrigued in the new atheism movement, although that had an influence, but I'd say the influence is not necessarily direct influence these days. It influenced me insofar as I realized it actually kind of led me into conclusions that are contradictory to that movement eventually. But that was certainly an evolutionary influence on my thinking. Before that, ideologically, I was raised Catholic. So I mean, there's a whole constellation of influences, but hopefully that traces some boundaries of the thought, and we can perhaps unpack some more specific exemplars as we go along.
Yeah, that's great, and that gives us plenty of starting wood to work with here. And when I messaged you originally, I'm actually glad to hear that I at least had some proximity in terms of my observations about who you are based on entirely online threads and things that I found. Your presence on the internet, more or less, in asking you to come on and talk about decentralization and the internet and consequences, not only structurally but also epistemologically of these things. It sounds like you've spent a very long period, at least of your adult life, thinking about these kinds of problems and in areas of research that are related to them. So where do I want to start then based on that? So I'm not going to ask you about your work in China, although I am curious, just because you said that you were keeping that a little hush-hush, which is fine. And perhaps more of that will be relevant long into the future. But I wanted to say about your interest in cryptocurrency. This is something that I haven't actually spent really any time talking about on this podcast, but has also been an interest of mine as well. I think anyone that looks into crypto very deeply understands that the technology provides an opportunity for building out a substrate that will fundamentally change the organization of, pretty much anything that you can think of in society. In particular, anything that you can put value on. There's an opportunity for demarcating and exchanging that value within the crypto space. Now, for me, as someone who's more politically minded and is asking questions related to, well, how should we set up our regimes? What is the best arrangement of governance for human flourishing? How do we make, the ideas that we've inherited, improve, or maybe we need to do away with them? All of these things to me are very intimately related to this additional layer that we've added to society called the internet, which is sort of freeing up where there were previously geographic boundaries to these kinds of questions that were delineated mostly by nation states. With the rise of the internet, you have this whole layer on top of society that's independent of the physical constraints of where people are on the globe. And so I wanted to ask you, you're probably much deeper into cryptocurrency than I am. I got really into it maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Learned a lot about Bitcoin, learned a lot about Ethereum, read all the white papers, and have sort of just been a casual follower of that space for a long time now. But I haven't recently gone really into the depth of some of the new development projects that are in place, some of the new ideas that people have about alternate governance structures, things like putting things like citizenship and passport, et cetera, on a blockchain, making those into smart contracts, selling people citizenship. These are just different examples of applications of current things that we have instantiated with nation states that could be instantiated in the form of smart contracts. How do you think about cryptography and its role in changing human governance? And have you spent a lot of time thinking about the ways in which the systems that we now have could be upgraded or even superseded by the inclusion of cryptographic technologies?
Sure. Yeah, I've spent quite a while thinking about that. I've written, I wouldn't say extensively yet on it. I have a lot of writings I haven't released, although back in 2018, I did begin a series of essays called Crypto Beyond Capitalism, the Rise of Distributed Valorism. For anyone who might want to get sort of a high level take on where my head was at then, and a little bit of a crystallized vision of kind of how I see that in the abstract. But to zoom out, and I think the first statement that I have to make, because when I talk about, we say cryptocurrency, right? Or you use cryptography there very specifically. But when we talk about the domain of cryptocurrency, people's mind immediately jumps to metaphors around economics, thoughts around money, thoughts around a very specific history of the way we represent value. And, to me, to really get at the question of how this relates to our political sense-making apparatus and our political institutions and our capacity as a species to actually collectively navigate space and time in an adaptive manner, you have to zoom out a bit and you have to look at money as something slightly different than what most people think it is. You have to look at money, at least from my perspective, as a subset of evolutionary linguistics. You have to look at this idea of the fact that, what is this fundamental problem we have as a semi-eusocial species that is simultaneously trying to navigate the fact that we are separated from one another in space and time, that we are individuated observers that can take our own paths, can experience the world in our own ways, develop our own preferences, have our own encoded biological personalities with their own, the associated tendencies towards different behaviors, different values, different ways of seeing the world, and then simultaneously the fact that we have to take all of those threads and connect them in some way through some medium of sharing information about those past experiences, about how they bear on the present and how we wish to stitch them together to create a future collectively in this space of quote unquote collective agency, or what is known as politics, the political realm. And when you look at the history of humanity, it's not the case that we always had institutions of politics, and it's not the case that we always had money. But it is the case that it's very hard to separate the emergence of humanity itself from the emergence of language, right? And so, language is one of these things where, we can talk about other animals and their capacity to communicate to some extent, but the elaboration, development, sophistication, and complexity of our language is quite unique. I would say it would be very hard to disprove that thesis in terms of, that is a defining characteristic of humanity. And the interesting thing about language is that language is this tool that we use to navigate that intersubjective space between the threads of our individual experience and the emergent collective abstractions we're able to generate to help us cohere as groups of more than one individual, or even more than one tribe. Or in theory, more than one nation. But, at some point it seemed to be the case that these tools, this tool of language, it wasn't necessarily sufficient for homogeneously governing all of the ways that we need to communicate about reality. It seemed to be the case that at the collective abstract level, we needed something that was a more slow-moving tool to allow us to talk in a very nuanced way about the long-term decisions that would affect a community. Out of that grew this lineage of political systems. And then on the other thread, we needed a tool to allow us to talk about finite transactable interactions and the sort of embodiment of our tendencies towards reciprocity. The ability to understand that if I helped you or I created something of value and then exchanged it with you, that should, in theory, that information about reality should not be lost. Whatever information there was in my ability to create something of value and bring it to the table in our society, that shouldn't be arbitrarily taken advantage of. That shouldn't be worth nothing. That should be, in theory, represented. Whatever it required me, whatever was required of me to actually create that value and bring it to the table should somehow be encoded in an accounting of the past so that we could navigate the present and future. And so, I would identify that tension between those two spaces as this divergent place in history where money and politics sort of diverge, despite the fact that they originated from the same sort of solution space, evolutionarily speaking. And what I find really fascinating about the world of crypto is that, it's I don't see it as it's not arbitrary that we're seeing these spaces of money and these systems of consensus and different modes of establishing consensus. It's not arbitrary that we're seeing them weave back together, because what we're seeing is an evolutionary pressure on the current systems that had separated these two domains of communication. And we're seeing evolutionary pressures that imply effectively that their separation is an insufficient mode of social structure for adapting to the level of complexity that we're presently seeing in the world. And so what we see, therefore, is that evolutionary pressure giving rise to much experimentation in the space of, well, how do we potentially weave these two modes of representing the world back together into a fabric that is sufficiently dynamic and of sufficient integrity to capture both of these necessities at these two different time preference and spatiotemporal scales of society, and more closely integrate them so that they don't have as much dissonance, conflict, and tendencies towards sort of self-termination as they presently do in terms of the interaction of money and politics. And so I would say, I would pause there just to say that that would be the frame through which I would enter this conversation. And I'm happy to let you respond to that and take this wherever you feel is interesting.
Sure. So, well, thank you for framing your perspective on thinking about it that way. While you were speaking, was recalling actually Friedrich Nietzsche's theory of justice, which he articulates in The Birth of Tragedy, that being that justice basically begins with the tracking of credits and debits, of debts and credits. And so from his perspective, even the idea of justice itself comes out of this very fundamental dynamic of exchange, essentially, and also of keeping a shared ledger. Now, obviously, those usually a peer-to-peer ledger between two individuals. We're not talking about a decentralized ledger that's replicated on every single node in a network. But it's interesting to me that you said that there was this sort of separation, and you view the projects now that are going on as kind of an attempt at a reunion of these concepts to diffuse some of the contradictions and some of the oppositions that are in place
Perhaps
as a result.
Higher order synthesis.
Yes. Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to bring up, though, that is kind of a wrinkle in that that I think we should work out, though, is that it's not simply that that the economic realm and the political realm are viewed as separate and distinct, but actually that in a way they're sort of competing to commandeer one another. And so I view nation states, for example, to be in basically competition with corporations for various kinds of power. There are certain kinds of power that, due to the advent of sovereignty and other things like that, are not available to corporations in the same way that they're available to nation states. But largely, I view them to be in competition. And the other thing, too, is that at least for the currencies that we currently have, or at least that we had before the invention of Bitcoin, those currencies have all historically been in the service of some state. And so if you weren't trading in gold or you weren't bartering in something else, then whatever currency you were using historically had to be backed by some sort of regime, usually by military force. And so it's interesting to me that you posited that there is this separation there, because I view it more like the fact that currency has sort of been in the service of various political entities as an instrument for them to extend their power, for them to exert power over others, for them to maintain control. And so obviously, as any Bitcoin evangelist will tell you, the exciting thing about cryptocurrency, the rise of crypto, is just that now we have once again a currency that is not tied to any particular state or institution or ruler of any kind. So what do you think of that?
Yeah. So when we're talking about the relationship between what we presently call the state as a sort of path-dependent function of the Treaty of Westphalia and the history that flowed from that, when we're talking about the interaction between that category of entities and what we're talking about as money, or as a controllable mode of representing valid value within the auspices or under the auspices of the state, we have to place that historically within the evolution of money. So when I'm talking about the pattern, the initial frame that I stated, that's a very deep frame. That's a frame that extends as deeply as the history of language and complex human society, right? And not society as in the idealized institutional society, the society as in, Dunbar level 1, 2 group organization society, early proto-society. And the fact that, when we talk about instruments like a quipu with the Incas or shell economies, these were pre-state. They antedated the states, the idea of a Westphalian state, the concept of a conscious political people by thousands of years, right? So, fast forward to our current position. And if we're looking backwards, we have to look through these layers of history. And so the first layers of history we're going to see are the most recent layers of history associated with the relationship between money and the state. And within that first layer of history, looking backwards through time, I do agree in many ways that the relationship between those two domains has been characterized by state entities, which were essentially, essentially evolved out of the consolidation of tribal power around particular geographic boundaries, right? And then the desire to maintain some sort of controlled stability, hierarchically controlled or top-down controlled stability within those geographic boundaries, to understand the extent, or to manipulate or understand or control the flows within their boundaries, right? And to establish rules governing what constitutes valid transaction in the eyes of a ruler, a centralized authority, right? Someone to provide seigniorage for that money, so to speak. So within that context, yes, like it is the case that the centralized, the logical endpoint of the desire to centralize the mode of controlling value from the perspective of like general intelligence, especially, and this might seem like a little bit of a divergence, but you know, I'm a big fan of the causal entropic forces mode of looking at intelligence, or the idea of like the free energy principle of intelligence.
What does that
The
mean?
idea. So I can. That's what I was just going to explain here, which is essentially the idea that when you're looking at a general definition of what intelligence might be at any emergent scale, a pretty good definition seems to be the kind of thing that can look at the modes, like that can forward project the modes of how its agency, how its potential ability to express itself in the future might be constrained by its environment, and that might terminate its ability to live and escape that, to keep continuing its ability to play the next round. And there are some deep mathematical models to show that this very simple principle, if encoded into agents that have no real pre-existing ability to understand what game they're playing or what their evolutionary landscape is, these agents can perform quite quote unquote intelligently. And so the reason I'm going to try to tie these two threads together is that, you know, let's say that you are some other kind of emergent entity growing within the pre-established boundaries of a state with their centralized currency, right? Well, what happens when the rules of that centralized authority, that state, its tax policies or its business regulations or whatnot, what happens when those begin to constrain the forward-looking paths to survival of companies? Well, they're going to try to escape those boundaries, right? They're going to try to step outside the authorities provided by the previously geographically encoded state or geographically rooted state, or geopolitically rooted state. And so, you know, before we saw the rise of currency, you know, it was certainly, I mean, the first trend we saw before that was, you know, let's say geopolitical arbitrage, right? Essentially, globalism is another word for that, right? The idea that if you are a large enough company, if you are a company that is gaining power and you have a vested interest in extending, well, A, maximizing your profits, and B, extending your lifespan for as long as possible, it's completely, you know, it is aligned with those incentives to try to find a mechanism to escape any authorities that might be arbitrarily or non-arbitrarily imposed upon you by any other container on that landscape. And so states were these initially, you know, these containers who only competed with externally emergent containers of that same order, right? So like humanity, initially, we were kind of geographically locked into wherever we were born. We didn't move around that much. Whatever cultures emerged at whatever rate they were emerging in their local domains. And then they came into conflict along borders. And then these borders at some point in time got kind of locked in. The state apparatus emerged. Currencies were sort of co-opted by the people managing those, let's call them cells, right? And within those cells, you had a sort of semi-stability with occasional warfare between these cells of various scales, where one cell might merge and become two, or one might collapse and be taken by multiple others. We can map that onto geopolitical language, or, you know, the language of warfare if we so choose. My particular way of seeing things is very much in the vein of emergent biology, let's say, and evolutionary biology. So like I use terms like cells. That being said, once you have a certain stability in that geopolitical structure, once you can draw a map of the world and not have to change those boundaries every 20 years or so, it becomes the case that you've set the stage perfectly for entities to be able to grow within those structures that can also eventually become sufficiently powerful to challenge those structures, especially if they can arbitrage value across the different cells, right? And so we saw this game emerge where corporations and, you know, sufficiently wealthy people would attempt to arbitrage the policies and the various economic tendencies or capacities of these different cells to maximize their output in the game, to maximize their wealth, to maximize their potential to live and thrive. A secondary effect of that was the fact that many of the people within these, you know, countries themselves who didn't have the ability to hop between those borders so fluidly ended up kind of at the mercy, at least in the short-term scales, at the mercy of the sort of macro logic of these game players. between the players at the state and the corporate level who are competing, playing this game of cat and mouse, as you mentioned, right? As you kind of framed it initially, and this idea that they're competing with one another for the reins of power and to essentially control which of these entities will gain the capacity to truly determine the rules of the game for the rest of those on the game board who don't have the ability to do so. And within all of that context, within that frame, within that history, that story of emergence and competition, you have the individual, and you have the addition of the internet. And the interesting thing there is it's allowed people across all of those different cells to connect, organize, sometimes chaotically. I mean, there's many negative externalities to this, but Bitcoin specifically is a really interesting example because it is essentially, I like to consider it a supranational mode of representing value. It's planting it's attempting to essentially, like, let's say that you have this sphere of these cells that's embedded structurally and deeply in its inertia and its institutions, their geographies, and the physical path dependencies. Like, for example, of just how arbitrary these physical path dependencies can be. It's like we have Washington, D.C. because people had to physically go to a place in the world, in space and time, from the different states to discuss what to do at the national level, because the entire institution was created at a time when we didn't have the tools that enabled us to do this remotely in any way, right? And so when we still have that extremely restrictive inertia, and so we see a sort of end around. We see the creation of a system that enables the representation of value alongside a very well-designed algorithm and game theoretically balanced process to try to not ensure, but to make capturability far less of a concern than it is with the capacity to print money, for example. So, like you're talking about before, like if you are a nation state and that cell has been corrupted, let's say by a sufficiently powerful corporation, the ability to print money in a way that is sustainable, let's say, comes into question very quickly, because the corporate entity will, first of all, look at the landscape and say, well, if I can benefit from operations in country X by having them print more currency and giving it to my own, if I simultaneously can encourage them to print more currency and I have co-opted policymakers to get that currency to flow into my coffers more effectively, I don't care about the long-term future of that nation. I don't care about their inflation. I don't care about any of these factors in terms of the stability of their nation, because I can jump to another cell globally because my operations aren't necessarily fixed or rooted in any of these places, and I can play this game of arbitrage. The cool move about Bitcoin is it says, no, we're going to game theoretically look at this. We're going to establish something that is resilient to attempts at such capture. It doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care what modes of political control you pull in any given cell in this game board, because the incentives will move away from you such that the more effort you put into trying to capture it, the more effort it will take to do so, generally speaking. And so it's like we've created a new game board. We've created a game board that has transcended or game theoretically reset the value space, let's say. And this is this quote unquote trust anchor. I mean, this is why I look at this as Bitcoin as the center of this entire new ecology. And that's a whole other story, but which we can get into. But I do think that is the key, right? You have this transfer of computation and energy with balanced game theoretic capture resistance, and it obviates a lot of the embedded advantages of the previous cellular structure that had emerged in the geopolitical landscape and the corporate behaviors that grew to parasitize that landscape. I guess I'll stop there. That was a lot of different topics, went in a lot of different directions, but hopefully that's somewhat coherent.
Well, then allow me to take a moment to attempt to digest some of that. So, one of the things that's interesting about Bitcoin that I think you said there is that it does have this, and this is, I think, more of the reason why the people who are real Bitcoin fanatics, in the real sense of the term fanatic, are so enthusiastic about it, which is that it has this really unique story, something that may not happen again, which is that it was able to escape this embedded cellular structure that you described. I'm going to use your metaphor just to make this easier. Um, and it did it. It did it very rapidly, and it did it in one fell swoop. And so, in a way, Bitcoin was sort of released on the world, and there is, we can all speculate about whether or not it could have been stopped, so to speak. I don't think now anyone would argue that it can be stopped. The proliferation, the continual growth of Bitcoin. You can debate whether or not Bitcoin will emerge as a global currency or whether it will emerge as the top cryptocurrency in the world in terms of market share. That's all up for debate, depending on who you are. But no one can say that that it's stoppable at this point, or that there's any way really of slowing it down through any kind of policy or monetary or regime restrictions. I think even if a multinational organization, if a supranational organization decided to try to form a global collective to clamp down on Bitcoin, well, it would just go hide in the empty spaces where it's not being, as you said, it moves away from whoever is trying to confine it. And so the fact that it escaped in one fell swoop is really interesting because I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about Satoshi Nakamoto and who he might be and whatnot. But if he hadn't been anonymous, and perhaps if Bitcoin had been more understood what it actually was in its infancy, there's a chance that I think it could have been crushed in the beginning when it was very, very young. But at a certain point, and I would say rather quickly, it disseminated throughout the world, and after a certain threshold, there's really nothing you can do to stop it. And so then the question is whether or not these existing entities are going to try to resist it, which I think is doomed to fail if you don't. I remember there was like something in the news a while back about India trying to ban Bitcoin, and it's just like, well, if you want to isolate yourself from the global economy and like the future of money, that's a good way to do it. It will basically just, no matter what, work to your disadvantage. And so there's no real way around it. As far as I can see from here, this is very fortunate that today is the Coinbase IPO for many who are not yet convinced. I was thinking today it'd be interesting to see how many people are buying Coinbase stock who don't own any cryptocurrency. I bet they're out there, and that's a wild contradiction to think about. But the point being, where was I?
I'm sure there's some risk, some risk minimization exposure theory that one could hypothetically conjure up to justify that. But yeah, I kind of agree with you. That would be mostly contradictory in terms.
Right. So if Coinbase is worth $100 billion, right, and right now a Bitcoin is worth like $64,000 or something like that. Maybe it's 62,000, depending on how it moved today. You've got this problem if you're a nation state on your hands, which is not, now there's this other thing that's totally outside of you, that's not within your control, and that threatens to upend your well, I would go to so far to say to upend your sovereignty, your economic sovereignty, because all these arguments about who's going to rule the 21st century. What are we going to do once we move into a multipolar world? Is it going to be the United States? Is it going to be China? Is it going to be some sort of alliance between either of those countries and in Western Europe, or maybe Russia and Iran will play a role? which way is India going to go? It's more likely India, well, since India really hates China, it will probably we'll have India on our side for at least a while. But all of these entities are their own individual states with their own mandates and agency. And so when I think about the multipolar world that we're moving into, I think that any nation state that tries to resist the adoption of these cryptocurrencies and isn't actually in the game of enabling their citizens, the people to whom they are ostensibly obliged to improve the lives of, if they don't take measures to actually improve the circulation of these things within their economies, I think actually they're going to end up losing that game pretty heavily. And of course, with the decline in the acceptability of kinetic warfare, for example, and the rise of being able to film everything and send it around the world instantaneously, as you probably know, and as it's been said many, many, many times, the future of warfare is going to be in cyberspace. It's going to be information war. It's going to be around issues of transmission and bandwidth and who gets access to different kinds of brain shares, who has an audience, who does not. And so all this is to say that there's going to be a real problem for anybody who's and the winner of the multipolar world. The winner of the multipolar world, if there is one, if you could say there would be one, I don't know how that works out game theoretically. Maybe you can speak to some of that. Is going to fundamentally establish themselves as dominant through economic means first. And that's sort of the contest we're in right now. The United States, if you're an American and you're pro-America, you want our GDP to remain the largest GDP on earth, because if you have GDP, that means you have purchasing power, which means that by implication, your consumer market controls the world effectively, because you're the one who everyone is trying to sell to and that people are producing for. And so I view Bitcoin as part of the information warfare complex. It's obviously a type of information. There's a reason these networks are called protocols. It's exactly as you were saying in the beginning. It's part of transmitting information, much like language. But in terms of sorry, maybe I should stop. I think I'm getting a little bit too ahead of myself. I wanted to ask you, how do you view the multipolar trap? Do you think that there can be some sort of stable equilibrium that we will get to at some point in the future? Do you think it will go for US or China? What are your views on sort of geopolitical implications of the century that we're moving into?
Yeah, okay.
Sorry about that. I know that was like a whole fire hose.
No, there's so much there to dig into. I mean, the multipolarity question is also, it's a deeply related question to these questions of representation of value and how that is tied into, like, how the virtual ties into the real world processes that we depend on for our life at individual scale, at community scale, at national scale. When the tie, I mean, it's fascinating, right? Because like this is currently demonstrated by many of these types of resolutions that are passed at the international level, where we will say one thing when we're all in a room together, where the leaders of our nations are all in a room together, because you can simultaneously gain the perceptual credit at the political level by saying the right thing in terms of cooperative language, right? And yet the incentives for cooperation are almost non-existent at the practical scale. Like once a Chinese leader goes back to China and looks at whether or not they're going to invest X in a coal plant or some multiple of X in a solar plant, that's going to be a very pragmatic decision. And I'm not saying that they're not investing in solar, because they actually, where it makes sense, they certainly are. but it has very little to do with what they're saying at these international conferences, and it has very much to do with where their interests lie in terms of so the regional economics of the energy needs versus the capacity to provide energy in various regions of their nation. And so it's like, okay, well, unless you have mechanisms that you trust and that are bound to physical infrastructure at a very embedded level, and are also tied in to the kind of geopolitical discussions we're talking about, or we would in theory talk about, or need that a multipolar, like a stable multipolar regime would necessitate, you're always going to have these problems of defection, because to the extent that cooperation creates value, I think this is something that's not fully appreciated. To the extent that cooperation creates value, the incentives for defection go up, right? It's like the more money you create on the table, the more incentive there is anytime that the group leaves the room for somebody to come back in and steal some of that value, right? So it's this dynamic where it's not as if cooperation actually leads to more cooperation by default. Cooperation of a number of parties in a multipolar game can very easily increase the incentives of any one of those parties to try to get away with not paying their dues. So with respect to the crypto conversation, or this other sort of distributed infrastructure conversation, well, would we, in theory, do we think we would see a world where nations are willing to increasingly embed, or would they have incentives to embed protocols or technologies that could generate, let's say, robust cooperation signals? Do we think that that's a reality ahead of us? Well, then you kick the can down to this question of like, okay, well, how do you guarantee correct implementation? How do you guarantee that the algorithms that China says it's using to track its carbon emissions in, let's say, I don't know, 10 billion different locations in China, if you're talking about like cars and people and processes that might emit carbon in some way, or the United States, like it's a big lift. It's a big lift to get any sort of game theoretic coherence that we would truly believe represents the ability to solve a multipolar trap through trust. Let's say trust in a given system. And so then you're kind of back in that same question of, that's always this historic question of, okay, well, then it comes down to force. It comes down to, if there's no authority that can leverage force outside of that to punish defection, then again you'll get defection. I don't know. It's hard. And then just there's this question of, when you're talking about the way that, just to loop in this question of warfare, because that was part of your initial question, your initial thrust here, moving into this space of information flows, because really, when we're talking about power, we're talking about, at least in my estimation, we're talking about flow control, right? In the physical landscape, you're talking about control in the flow of resources, goods, people across borders, boundaries, monetary flows, things of that nature. Increasingly, all of this is digital, right? We still have food flows, we still have very real flows that are infrastructural, but we have increasing those infrastructural flows are also controlled by informational flows, right? There's a virtual model of the infrastructural network. That virtual model, if it can be corrupted or diverted or changed, then you can potentially wage warfare on another nation through means that are not directly provable. And so you get back to the same question of, can you embed trustworthy mechanisms in the virtual infrastructure that would regulate those games in the same way that certain emergent phenomenon, like in the same way that certain games emerged in the domain of nuclear warfare to regulate those games. But that was just an escalation game until we got to mutually assured destruction. Like, do we end up in the same place with respect to just informational mutually assured destruction, where so many informational infrastructural systems are compromised, and each nation can prove that to one another, that you reach a détente. Is it possible? Because then we get into these very strange, or not strange, we get into questions of computer science in terms of, well, how difficult would it be to actually create highly complex networks of information management associated with the infrastructure of a nation that are fully resilient to capture or to infection. And if you ask any InfoSec authority on that, you probably get a very skeptical answer, even including cryptographic utilities or cryptographic mechanisms such as zero knowledge proofs and things of that nature, where you could in theory create mechanisms to bolster our faith in other nations that they're doing what they say that they're doing and that they're not being bad actors. But I don't know, like, I think that there are reasons to think that we can improve our ability to regress to outright conflict that negatively or adversely affects the actual lives of large numbers of people on the planet. Increasingly, I suspect that some of these game theoretic issues are too deep to escape fundamentally, that we keep playing them out at different levels. Maybe, as you were initially alluding to, we first played them on the level of direct physical force. Perhaps you could say that in terms of warfare, we just increasingly destroy lives more and more indirectly, right? Or we exert the same amount of force in terms of necessary control. We just do it through a multiplying number of fine-grained mechanisms as opposed to coarse-grained, obvious mechanisms. Now, is that better? I don't know. Perhaps it's better. I think we're into territory here where it's just, there's so much uncertainty that it's, we can speculate and we can talk about it, but I don't know if there are solutions that are obvious, at least.
Yeah, well, so what you said there about defection actually ties nicely into the next topic that I wanted to get to, which is our sort of cascading epistemological crises. And so as far as there is an incentive to defect, is there some sort of prize to win by offering invalid or false or misleading information on any network in the information space, whether it's through a podcast or a video, or you're just tweeting, or even, writing up, falsifying various kinds of scientific findings. I mean, all of these things are related to this idea of how much can I get for injecting corruption into the system and for defecting. And the solution to what people are calling the epistemological crises that we're in, whether you're talking about, fake news and disinformation, or different kinds of propaganda projects that are going on, people building bot armies. I mean, whatever methods people are using to act out these behaviors. The solution is ultimately going to revolve around whether or not we can make the cost of defection higher than the benefit that is to be gained from it. Now, you seem a little bit skeptical that even, or at least on the level of nation state infrastructure, that question, that even cryptographic technologies provide a way out for that. Do you think that, for example, we are going to eventually get better at building social networks, various kinds of information sharing and dissemination networks, peer-to-peer, that put things in place to solve that problem of defection in terms of in the information space, specifically by individuals? I'm not here talking about nation states. Do you know of any solutions? Are you aware of any of the sort of forthcoming research on this? Have you thought about this question at all? what to do with with basically a surfeit of information and a surfeit of information, and I would say a lack of I don't want to say wisdom, but some information you can build on and some information you cannot. And so you can almost define wisdom in that sense. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, that would be perhaps what I would define as pragmatic epistemology, right? The idea that you could actually that whatever your abstractions, whatever abstractions you may hold in your mind to represent reality, that those abstractions can be transformed into actual physical behaviors that achieve your desired ends, that actually work, that those programs run in reality. They map to your behaviors, and if you actually can execute the behaviors with fidelity to your models, the expected output, the expected outcome occurs, right? And that can be, models as simple as those that are completely innate, like picking up a can and taking a sip of a beverage, as I just did. Which is like, it's interesting, right? Because in theory we could posit, I use that as an example, because in theory we could posit the idea, like this is the divergence between words, like this is an epistemological question. Like I can say to you very easily, I live in a world where regardless of whether I use my hand to pick up the drink and pour it in my mouth, nothing will come out. And I can just say that, right? Because those are words. Like they have no actual connection to the physical process that just occurred. And yet every time until this can is empty that I do this, at least to my knowledge, my inductive capacity to understand this, if I do the behavior of picking up the can, putting it to my face, tilting it such that gravity can take effect upon the liquid, that liquid is going to flow out the hole that's below the other side of the can, right? It's just, that's how it happens. And it doesn't matter that I told you one thing, except for the fact that if I can make the idea, if I can divorce that idea increasingly, like, it's very easy and silly to talk about this in terms of a can and the liquid inside of it. But the more abstract the idea and the more removed we are from the consequences, the easier it is for me to smuggle in abstractions that I can use to arbitrage value out of you in the short term, regardless of the fact that the outcome in reality still doesn't change, right? So like if it were possible for me to convince you that, if you were to bet me that if I could convince you, right, at a deep enough level such that you were willing to bet someone else $10 that when I took that drink of soda, nothing would come out, right? Then, and I had made another side bet with that person or side deal with that person that they would just give me the $10. I can, extract that from you all day, right? If I can implant that idea in your mind. And we very much, we've always lived in a world where this is possible, but the difficulty threshold for performing this kind of abstract arbitrage via mimetic parasitization, let's say, it's never been easier, and people have caught on, and it's increasingly defining these social spaces in terms of the fact that there are exploding cottage industries where people are making pretty decent livings out of convincing people to perform short-term behaviors that generate value for the person putting these ideologies out into the world, and yet overall increasingly seem to be eroding our capacity to live in a society with one another, to effectively operate governance structures, to potentially even conduct meaningful scientific inquiry into the world. Increasingly, it seems that way. And so this question of how we actually understand our epistemology, you framed it in terms of defection and punishment. There's another way of looking at it in terms of, is it possible to attract people to the outputs of the right, or not the right? Is it possible to set an example of a system where the consensus is so undeniably desirable that people simply don't wish to participate in the other games? Because I think that might be the only stable solution, because it's very difficult to fully close all avenues to extracting value through sort of parasitizing people's tendency toward abstraction. It's increasingly true because, just like people like Eric Weinstein talk about the twin nuclei problem, right? Of gating access to both, the capacity to split the atom and the capacity to explore the cell through genetic inquiry and technology. But also you could add a triad to that. You could say understanding the human mind. The advances we've made in terms of behavioral psychology is also, when you pair that with a tool like the internet, is extremely potent. And we've scaled, where do most of these PhDs get hired eventually? They get hired companies who are essentially doing, advertising, right? Trying to understand how to, or, social media, but, social media is at root an advertising business, at least it has been thus far. And so you have this third nuclei, so to speak, of the ability to predictably and formulaically manipulate human behavior with intent, regardless of long-term outcome and regardless of fidelity to any sort of pragmatic reality. So it seems very difficult to stymie that trend using any kind of by escalating the cost of doing so. That seems to lead very quickly towards authoritarian mechanisms of central control on these networks, which is what we see to some extent to a large extent with the first generation of social media companies, with Facebook, with Twitter. We see an attempt to essentially excise or impose pain on those who are purporting models of reality that are not consonant with the perspective, the approved perspective of those in control of those networks, right? Which begs the question, or it sort of raises the question, whose perspective gets to, who gets to encode their perspectives into the fundamental mode of perception, let's say, of the network? Because it kind of makes this assumption that the network has a point of view. That's a very strange assumption to make about a network, that has a point of view. The epistemology of humanity is far more decentralized than that. And the fact that evolution has preserved a variety of personalities and perspectives is evidence of the fact of the utility of those differences in perspective, right? And so we're going directly against what we know to be adaptive in terms of the evolutionary solution to this problem of viewing the world and trying to make sense of the world. And we're going directly opposite of that. And so then the question is, like, in this new generation of modes of communicating socially using the internet, or whatever the sort of whoever will carry the torch of today's internet, is it possible, like, what would it look like to have social communication in these online spaces that allows for emergent sense making and sort of like a multi-perspectival bottom-up truth mechanism, so that it's not necessarily the case that it's enforced in any other way than pragmatic capacity to act as a group using these models that emerge through what, right? That's the question. And have we seen mechanisms that are powerful enough to allow for this yet? And it doesn't seem that we have. It seems, it's still a very open question as to what kind of Pandora's box we've unlocked by connecting every single human being at the speed of light, fundamentally, right? Like, and if we're capable of creating protocols that allow for that new potential to be harnessed into something adaptive as opposed to something explosive, something self-destructive, we're working through it. I mean, those protocols, it would seem to be the case that a huge part of this seems we need some sort of necessary emergent compartmentalization. You can't have purely open spaces. Like, I think one of the aspects of current social networks that almost guarantees the fact that the only mode of control that will emerge is attempted centralized crackdown, is the fact that you have no naturally emergent structure that precludes just complete connectivity, or the fact that you have these swarm behaviors. It's almost a defining characteristic of the current moment. The triggering of a sort of a swarm of attention around an online space in an immediate, like for example, with what just happened again in Minnesota, in terms of the fact that an event can happen and you can have riots, or you could have large groups of people congregating in the physical world before someone is even processed, let's say, or before anything happens, before any of the traditional institutional mechanisms that attempt to try to sort out the complexity of that situation have even begun to swing into play, right? Mm-hmm. And so why does that happen? Well, it happens because you have such an immediate spread of that information so widely in space and time, and you can focus so much human attention on that, and the vector is occurring through a mode of communication, like a anxiety and fear-based mode of communication that we know from our research into neuroscience and behavioral psychology, that when you are in that mode, like when you enter this fight or flight mode, you're not using the parts of your brain that are capable of subtle rational thinking. You're not able to actually parse apart the modes of, or the piece of information in that situation that you would need to dissect and to analyze to really understand what happened. We regress to a purely reactive mode of being. And so it's like you have an open network and you create a completely reactive society. And if you create a completely reactive society, it seems very unlikely that anything stable emerges from that. And that's, circling all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, theoretical models by people like Kaufman show that this is the case. And he calls it a complexity catastrophe. And I think that all of our current social networks are subject, not only subject to, but guarantee complexity catastrophe. And a primary design principle of any network that wishes to facilitate a transition to a better place in our sort of socially networked internet space needs to take that complexity catastrophe very seriously. It needs to take the implications of over-connected networks and completely open networks very seriously, without treating it in a tyrannical mode of attempting to centrally preclude communication, which is a very hard problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I always think to myself when I hear people on Twitter or outside of Twitter complaining about the level of discourse that goes on there, that if I was an evil genius and I wanted to, and I was existing before Web 2.0, and I wanted to create a technology that would drive the entire world insane, I would create something like Twitter, where everyone can talk to anybody and there's no barriers at all, because that is literally how you would drive somebody insane, because all of their narratives, all of their worldview is shaped by a particular locale that they have grown up in. And even if you've moved around a lot, you still have a particularity about how you came to be formed with the ideas that you have. And so if I take people from Pakistan and I take people from Minnesota, and I just like one day, have them like be introduced to each other serendipitously, and they have to suddenly shake hands, and there's no pre-existing context for why they would be talking or why they would be interacting with one another, then yeah, it would very quickly devolve into a kind of insanity, especially if then the mode in which they were interacting was the sharing of their opinions and beliefs and ideas about the world. And so, yeah,
everything is like that, right? Everything in nature is like that. Everything in our world is like that, in the sense that, anything that emerges and stabilizes naturally bottom up, a fundamental aspect is a kind of mediated boundary, right? The idea that The idea that reactions don't just, you can't get any complexity if you have a space that just allows all reactions with no with no limiting principle, with no energy barrier, so to speak, between those reactions. You just get, essentially chaos. If you look at any sort of stable biological structure, you have layer upon layer of bounded purpose, let's say, bounded structure, bounded cellular structure, organelles, organs at higher orders. You have bounded complexity, right? You have the complexity of a particular space that has evolved for a particular purpose, and it mediates. It doesn't just open up all of that internal complexity directly, as you're talking about. It's like the person from one nation doesn't just go to another nation, and two people converse and immediately are able to connect with one another on all of the different dimensions of their preferences, on their history, or their language. That doesn't happen. You need a catalyst. You need and a catalyst can be something that either speeds up or slows down reactions, right? So you need something to mediate this contact, because if you have unmediated contact, all you have is either non-reactivity or pure reactivity, right? Mm-hmm. And either of those are either, on one hand, non-reactivity is uninteresting and is tantamount to death, and on the other hand, pure reactivity is too interesting and also tantamount to death, right? Yeah. So it's like, how do you create these? What are these catalysts? What are these mechanisms that allow us to, or protocols you could think of them as, that allow us to realize the value of mediated interaction that allows for, let's say, increasing diversity of interactions to be something that is adaptive as opposed to something that is destructive. Because this is the issue. Like we've become so incapable of publicly discussing, because the spaces are so open and there are so many eyeballs looking at these spaces. The language that is selected for and the way that we deal with and talk about these problems becomes so compressed that we can't say anything other than like diversity good or diversity bad. It's like, no, it's like you can't speak that. No chemist would speak that way about the probability of certain reactions occurring in a soup of a field of chemicals, depending on, it depends on their energy barriers, it depends on their concentrations and gradients. It depends on a whole range of factors in terms of whether you're going to get reactions or, synthesis of polymers or explosions, right? It's like, it all depends on very specific contextual factors. And to the extent that we lose the capacity to have those conversations, because every conversation is had immediately in a reactive frame of reference in the most visible public space possible, we are going to completely lose whatever remaining capacity exists to navigate complex social spaces, and we are not going to generate the increased capacities necessary. Because this is the issue, that it's not as if we're in some stable state or steady state where we're losing capacity to deal with these complex issues at a social scale, and the context is remaining stable in terms of sort of latent complexity. No, the complexity of the world is growing. We're opening up new vectors of difficult problem domains. We're opening up new possibility spaces of growth and death, right? We've created, I don't know, man. It's so strange to me that we are in a space where we've opened up the human genome and we are talking about the ability of people to subjectively define their biological sex, right? Simultaneously, those two worlds exist simultaneously. And at one level, we have this superpower, and they're kind of related to some extent. It's like you could have the conversation saying, like, and they are related insofar as the question is it possible to take control of that informational capacity and steer it in any direction we so choose? And, that might be the case. I would probably bet against it, just because probabilistically there are way more ways to fail, like infinitely more ways to fail in any of these domains than there are to succeed. But we can't even have the conversation at the level of understanding the mechanisms of genetic expression, because we're so focused and captured by the entertainment value of the simplistic ability of certain people to push our buttons to get us to keep sort of coming to the little, to keep pulling the the handle on the slot machine, let's say, that is our phone or is our computer or is our television.
Mm-hmm.
We have a very hard time freeing ourselves to be able to get to those necessary conversations or to develop the capacity to understand the world such that we can have those conversations. Like it seems like a very small subset of the world is becoming hyper intelligent and gaining capacity beyond belief. And a very large segment of the population is being conditioned as something like economic livestock. And despite the fact that it's never been easier to learn and never been easier to gain this knowledge, it's never been harder to carve out the attention or extract yourself from the pre-designed sort of economic extraction mechanisms that govern so many of our lives. So, yeah.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up the biological aspect there, because I think one of the things that's going on is that the biological inheritances that we have for understanding and processing the world and orienting ourselves, given the information that's presented, are severely outdated. Now, I will make a caveat to that, which is that I think that humans are actually pretty good at learning. And so I think we actually are learning better how to interact with these systems and how to do more of a reversal on the relationship that we have to these networks, so that we're not so easily being sort of pulled along by our limbic systems. But there is this problem, which is that our evolved mechanisms for making sense of the world and guiding our direction, directed action, are insufficient for dealing with this super stimuli that we have in front of us. And so, maybe my feelings of being ashamed back when we were operating at Dunbar level numbers, just to give you an example, were adequate and actually accurate and also helpful to me. Because if I was cast out by my tribe, that meant near certain death. And so it was very important for me to have a well-calibrated sense of shame, and that shame corresponds to the people that are in my community, in my networks. Because without that, I don't continue on to the future. We talked earlier about one way of defining intelligence is not necessarily optionality, but the ability to defer destruction, basically.
Yeah. That feedback signal was pure, right? Or not pure, but it was far less adulterated. The signal to noise ratio was far higher, right? It was much more like the conversation we had about, lifting the can to the mouth and what's going to happen, than it is like these hyper-mediated, very abstracted loops that currently exist that we still treat the same way, despite the fact that there are some unknown number of economic actors also in that loop with us, with different incentives than us, or that, in your example, right, like you and your immediate small tribe would have presumably much more aligned incentives than the people within a current loop. Let's say that you run a Google search and how some unknown number of people are bidding for your attention at the nanosecond scale, governing the perceptions that you're about to have and the path that you might then take in the world. And maybe those are aligned with your incentives and maybe not. So it's just much more abstract, much larger loop governing that process.
Yeah.
Sorry for interjecting.
Even something as simple as like, online mobbing behavior, right? So if I say something on Twitter and I suddenly get a mob coming after me, those people are going to make me feel, maybe depending on how I feel about what I did, they're trying to make you feel ashamed. They're trying to sort of shame you and make you have negative affect, I wouldn't even say necessarily change your behavior, since most of the people in that scenario probably are never interacting with you again and probably didn't interact with you before that point. But actually, it's like a sort of a form of it still operationalizes as a similar thing as it would in the tribe, which is that it's a mechanism for weeding people out, right? Which is for removing unsocial elements of that society. So if I do something bad at the Dunbar level and then as a result of that, my tribe does kick me out and I am ostracized. Well, for them, that's actually a protection mechanism in order to maintain the integrity of the society. Whereas on Twitter, you could view it as a similar thing, but it's not necessarily about maintaining the integrity of that society. As you said, there are all of these, they're still trying to get you out, right? You might get banned. You might just decide to delete your account as a result of the stress, whatever happens. But as you said, like there's all of these opaque incentives at play. And so you don't know who's piling on and what their intentions are, what their motives might be, whether or not they even know why they're doing it. So maybe someone, back to like the cascading epistemology, maybe someone told them that you said something or that you did something that you didn't actually do, and they're misrepresenting it. But then they go and they decide that they need to go pile on anyway. And so there's many layers to the way in which all of these things can just get distorted and totally ruined.
What are the selection factors that are governing the norms that are in question, right? Because like when you're talking about the Dunbar, like lower Dunbar scale tribes, right? Or like, a much smaller group of individuals or a group of, or a community, let's say, the norms that are in place that will determine whether or not the members of that society perceive a violation as warranting expulsion of an individual, those have been crafted over long periods of time. They're relatively unchanging. They're in quite close contact with a given embodied and situated context, lifestyle, adaptive niche, let's say, right? And so there's this consonance and stability there. Now, when you go into our current space, what happens if the selection mechanism is far more like something like Turchin's intra-elite competitive dynamic, right? Like if the selection mechanism is a meme that allows a group of people access to status, authority, or economic advantage, right? If that's the selection mechanism, well, that can change on a dime, right? And these things can change very quickly. They can emerge very quickly. They can become quite uncorrelated from any pragmatic reality other than the sort of intuitive desires of those who are swept up in that cascade. Mm-hmm. And so you can see these sorts of expulsions that occur not because of violations of any deep, abiding, or adaptive truths, but just because of the fact that you fall afoul of someone else's logic of, let's say, in the case of intra-elite competition, their sort of local logic of carving out a new niche in an overcrowded space of authority or power or competence.
Yeah, and like you were talking earlier, you mentioned the bifurcation of our population that's sort of happening, and one way of phrasing it that like you did is that there's sort of like the online people and then the not online people. Or, in Twitter parlance, these would be like the normies. Now, obviously, not everyone who's online is necessarily plugged in, and there are different gradients, whatever, however you want to decide to parse that. The point being that there is this weird dynamic that I think yourself and myself and others who are spending more of our time online and are trying to create things online and so forth have become attuned to, which is that the world that we're moving into is going to assign less value to the material space as we move forward. And increasingly, the people who are going to be evolutionary, so I wanted to ask you actually first, what kinds of people do you think are more optimized for functioning in this environment? And what kind of effect do you think that will have on the population? Because you talked earlier about this issue of like economic livestock. And one of the anxieties that I have, for example, as an American, is just like I care about America. I like this place. I think we're a pretty special place, and I like the people in it. And most of the people that I know are American, and so I care about them too. But there is a sense, and I'm going to just use specifically the American context here, that there is this weird thing going on with economic livestock and with exploitation. And the way that I see it going on is that a large amount of the not only capital flows, but also social capital flows, prestige, and so forth, is moving to those who are well adapted or have positioned themselves well within various online spaces, and away from the people who are focused on, let's say, building bridges or delivering your groceries or, getting your Amazon packages. Those people are still necessary for all of these other people who are living online or making a living online, if you are, to keep going, because we're all biologically embodied and we're all in a physical location. And so we need those things to keep chugging along rather peacefully, I would say, also to not have any disturbance in our operations. But at the same time, there's a sense that a lot of those people are going to be left behind. And the anxiety that I feel is also that if I don't sort of step up and try to be more part of this world and try to achieve some of those gains that are out there and potential, that I would be left behind too. And this ties very closely into also what we were discussing about the outdatedness of nation states. Like, it's not clear to me, for example, that Amazon or Walmart or Twitter or Facebook or any of these ostensibly American organizations actually have any real interest in the lives of the American people, for example, and in making those lives better and improving them, because of the fact that they view themselves as these supranational organizations, kind of like Bitcoin. I mean, you could say, people say they're multinational, right? But really, they're not really operating within the confines of any one territory. And so, how do you think about sort of the hollowing out of America that's happening? And what do you think about this sort of bifurcation of the population that's happening? Because I think, especially with like the rise of remote solutions to various kinds of things and subcultures like digital nomads and so forth, there is this sense that there's this large group of people who could just sort of detach, right? If they have the economic means from any particular, let's just say, national locale, and just sort of move around the world to wherever the incentives are set up better for them. How do you think about those issues?
I think one lens to apply, or the primary lens that I tend to apply to many of these questions, is one of time preference and the way that certain processes select for different time preferences, and the way that those time preferences then shape who is able to capture the most value on a given landscape. So I'll give you a couple concrete examples. The first is, I would say that the dynamics that you're talking about in our current transition are analogous to something that has existed actually for quite some time that I will now describe, which is one of the reasons why it's been very difficult for us to compensate anyone in our society whose value manifests itself in physical reality across long periods of time. So teachers would be a very good example of this, right? It's very difficult to find appropriate compensation schemes that actually map to the impact that teachers have in our world. And I'm not saying that all teachers are underpaid or whatnot. I'm simply saying, I'm noting the fact that when you have a group of people whose purpose it is to shape minds that then go into the world to create value, it's very difficult to tie back the value created to the people who initially performed a task that was sliced across different subjects, perhaps, and 1 year intervals across 18 to 20 whatever years, right? It's difficult, it's complex to allocate that. So we have this issue where, okay, well, what happened there? We see a pattern where people whose value manifested slowly didn't get anywhere near as much of the economic pie as those whose value could manifest more transactionally and more quickly. This was let's say we're reaching the apotheosis of this to some extent through the financialization of much of our economy, where it begins to make sense to dig increasingly straight trenches through the earth at the cost of billions of dollars to gain, nanoseconds on another party in terms of your trading behavior. Literally like moving mountains to move information slightly more quickly. It's the definition of sort of low time preference driven economics. And what I'm kind of getting at is, in the same way, we have an entire base layer of physically associated processes that are actually quite necessary. Like, we need people to take care of physical infrastructure on our roads, on our bridges, to perform like medical procedures, at least for now, care along a number of dimensions, physical care, psychological care, home care, all of these physical processes, right? And even the physical processes, like, for example, law and medicine, that were quite recently the kinds of professions that people, if they had, immigrated here, for example, and wanted to ensure that they could get a pretty strong foothold in the economic ladder in our nation, would go into those accredited domains, and those processes could pretty much guarantee that you have a sort of step function economically that can then position you much more advantageously and your family much more advantageously over time. And now we're seeing a shift with this internet mediated economy where, because attention has become so correlated with currency, we're seeing a shift where a huge amount of value, as you point out, is moving even away from this base layer of previously acknowledged value, because our perception of what's valuable is shifting due to our attentional allocation. And so the same thing, as strange as it is, like, relativistically, these base layer physical processes are increasingly becoming more like that previous category of processes like teaching, that were kind of hard to actually allocate value to because they didn't map as closely or as directly to our currency mechanisms and our economic systems, right? Because currently, like, if you look at an online world, if you look at a social media click-driven world, attention-driven world, the easiest things to compensate are those that directly gain attention and give transactional value in that space directly, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that is the primary, or one of the primary economic drivers of this, which is just this shift of time preference and the shift of the mechanisms that we use to convey value, which actually ties back into one of the reasons why I find Bitcoin so valuable. Because one of the ways that I like to characterize Bitcoin is also as a low time preference attractor, right? This idea that because this is deflationary structure, that doesn't necessarily, its logic doesn't depend on that increasingly high time preference of the rest of society. It can actually allow people who want to dislocate from this trajectory of increasingly increasingly attentional acceleration, to, in theory, if they believe that this is a sustainable path of storing value, to invest some amount of their time or an energy or money into this space, and then use that time increasingly to free themselves such that they can have conscious contact with whatever this accelerating space is, as opposed to being trapped by the economic logic of its acceleration, right? As opposed to saying, I have to go move into a space of being constantly online, because if I'm not online, I'm going to miss the next great economic opportunity. How do we enable people to still stay connected with that first primary physical layer of reality, attentionally, in their embodied lives, and actually see it as valuable? So I do think that we're seeing, I don't think it's random that we see people like homesteading communities or other kinds of sort of, let's say, reactionary communities gravitating around a culture like Bitcoin, and simultaneously being suspicious of this acceleration into a completely virtualized domain where all value is increasingly determined by whatever can get the most attention. There's a deep suspicion of the fact that whatever can get the most attention isn't necessarily the most adaptive mode of life, and that there needs to exist some kind of balance that can stretch our incentives across time, and not just have a race at the bottom of the fastest and the first to cross an arbitrary, finish line of attention seeking take the economic gains primarily. It doesn't seem like a sustainable society. So it's like there is this question of how do we actually allocate value across time horizons more in a way that isn't, in a way that allows us to retain social complexity and adaptive capacity.
Yeah, and like I think this is reflected in like many kinds of dystopic visions that people are putting into art forms right now. Like, ideas about sort of everyone kind of wireheading and just sort of finding various ways, whether it's through TikTok or some sort of virtual reality headset in the future with haptic feedback, and you just sort of like leave most of society plugged into these devices. And over time, that kind of undermines the very substrate that even makes this kind of a complex society possible, because people are too focused on these other, the attention component, monetizing attention.
It's almost like 1984 is to the Matrix as Fahrenheit 451 is to our actual likely path to this sort of wireheaded space. Right? It's like we were worried that it would be some sort of AI generated outside authoritarian force in contest with humanity, and in reality, once again, we seem to be like following our own incentives to similar ends, potentially, right?
Yeah.
Without even having to have some sort of evil outside authority or alien AI driven life form to do it to us. It's like we seem perfectly content to lead ourselves down these paths. So at least to the extent we don't think about it, that's what seems to happen. So how do we create culture? How do we create subcultures? How do we create art? How do we create representations of value that allow us to, or at least some of us, I would say, to keep a connection? I'm not against virtual spaces. I think that there's an immense amount of potential in the internet. There's an immense amount of potential in information sharing and access to the world's knowledge, automatic translation capacity across languages. The Babelfish capacity is I would say a massively positive potential capacity that could flow from all of this. But we need to find a way to rein in our tendency towards just accelerating any process that maximizes what I would consider an outdated symbol of value, which is like our current monetary symbols that are just completely dislocated from any adaptive reality, other than what maximizes. It's like sort of turned into a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of whatever maximizes the production of those monetary symbols in some way. And and through a perverse lens, you could also see one mechanisms of maximizing the number of net symbols as the capture of systems of governance and the coercion of those systems of governance to essentially continuously print more and more of that currency, such that the entities in the economy that require that liquidity are satiated. And again, to what end? Like, to what end does this actually facilitate the adaptive complexity of the society writ large? It's hard to see exactly. Sorry.
Well, so I'll just say that for me, at least, when I think about solutions to these exploits in human operating systems that exist and that are increasingly economically relevant, I'm biased towards philosophy. I'm biased towards trying to encourage a culture of consideration, right, about these things, about questions of the good, questions of what is it to live a meaningful life. As you said, there's going to need to be some kind of balance between the online world and the physical world. And just in terms of, if we're trying to optimize overall well-being, not even necessarily happiness, there has to be some sort of attention paid to these questions about what is the proper order of things. And going back to the point you made earlier about the nature of biological structures, it holds here too that you can actually get things that are more beautiful and more complex if you choose to apply constraints than if you don't. And so there is strength in applying constraints, and I think that there are going to be technological solutions, but there also needs to be, at least from my perspective, the humanistic component, which is a reevaluation of like, okay, well, maybe we don't have everything figured out. Maybe staring at my phone for 7 hours a day isn't the best way to be living my life or to using my time on this earth. And so these questions haven't yet been resolved, and I don't think they will be anytime soon. So Matt, we're running up on almost 2 hours here. And I don't want it to unfairly continue to monopolize your time. So I've got a few more questions here before I let you go, if you have it, if you have a minute. I wanted to get into the relationship between fitness and truth, because we've been kind of circling around, I would say, this throughout many of the threads of this conversation. And a lot of people tend to, I think, naively or maybe intuitively assume that that fitness and truth very much map onto one another, and they don't necessarily. So I'm having Daniel Hoffman on, for example, later, who's at UC Irvine, who's done a lot of research very similar to what you described. He's a cognitive scientist, and so he's done a lot of research with agent-based modeling and evolutionary algorithms, and trying to see, well, which actually results in the net better payoff, optimizing for fitness or optimizing for truth. And he was nice enough to send me along actually some of his papers, which I'm going to be working through before we have our conversation. But the point being that from my understanding of the results of his research, which I haven't yet fully taken a look at myself, is that in evolutionary strategy games, the entities, organisms, or whatever you want to call them, that are optimized for fitness win out to the point of extinguishing against the organisms that are optimized for truth, basically 100% of the time. And so all of this is a preface to ask you this question about this epistemological crisis and the attention economy. And we could talk about the buzzword grifters, right? There's all these grifters out there, and they're all grifting, right? And everyone it seems like at a certain point of popularity, anyone who's on the internet doing anything interesting at all will get called a grifter, whether or not they are. Now, there are real grifters out there. I'm not going to take the time to define it right now. But the point being, if it's true that there is this adversarial relationship between fitness and truth, and that the entities that are optimizing for truth will lose out to the entities that are optimizing for fitness, how do I square that circle? Like, I've got a podcast. I'd like it to grow. I'd like it to do well. I'd like my audience to be larger. I would like, this to expand into other things. And yet at the same time, I have this it's true. I have this commitment to wanting to spread the truth. I want to, as best as I can, have fidelity to the actual state of things. And yet there is a kind of functional truth that's different from absolute truth. So in the very beginning of this conversation, you brought up like picking up this cup, right? And the sort of cognitive processes and the perceptual operations that are involved in moving this cup, and questions about causality and object permanence and whether or not there'll be water in it after you take a sip, all of these things. When I'm moving this cup, I don't have to sit around and actually understand the truth of the action that I'm taking. Like, I'm not interpreting equations in my head that map out all of the physics of moving this cup, of picking it up and putting it in my hand and putting it back down. I don't need to do any of that, because I have an evolved perceptual structure that sees the cup as an abstraction of these more fundamental forces that exist. And all it needs to know is that there's a cup there, and that cup has, some now cold coffee inside of it, and that coffee, if I take a sip of it, will give me some kind of fitness payoff. And so I don't necessarily need to even know the truth, so to speak, of the cup itself, or of the action that I'm taking with the cup, in order to operationalize myself in the world to my benefit. How do you think about the relationship between truth and fitness? Earlier, you made it sound as if the definition of intelligence that you were positing at the beginning of this conversation sounded very, very close to fitness as such. So how do you think about that tension? And yeah, maybe we'll leave that as the penultimate question. I have one more.
Well, I will say that this question could act as the doorway to an entire 2-hour conversation of its own, perhaps a series of 2-hour conversations. This is at some level the question. It's also, it's a question that has animated a great deal of intellectual conversation over the past few years. This was at the center of Harris and Peterson's tension as well, because people like Peterson identify truth and fitness in that sense.
To conflate them, I would say.
Well, one could say a conflation. The pragmatic. There is this interesting question in terms of, well, at what scale? So something that I have been fascinated by along these lines, and that I articulated briefly in the last essay of that Crypto Beyond Capitalism essay that I mentioned earlier, is something called Newcomb's paradox, and some of the implications that flow from that. People can find a description of it on, I think in the Less Wrong community, they have that, and they have a page that is a bunch of other analogs to this game theoretic problem that we find in the world. And the oversimplifying and boiling this paradox down, it comes down to this idea that there are higher payoffs that are inaccessible if one is unwilling to take a short-term, irrational decrease in payoff, right? So essentially, there are optima that are precluded to greedy maximizers, one could say, right? And the question then becomes this interesting question of, okay, well, if we're talking about fitness, right, outcompeting quote unquote truth, we have to have our definitions pretty well established. We have to get specific about what we mean by these things. Do we mean, fitness over what timescale, amongst how many populations, right? It's like if we're just running two populations in a sort of toroidal infinite landscape, like on a agent-based simulation, and we assume that's the universe, and then the quote unquote truth-based population drops to zero and therefore has no more potential to ever re-enter the game, we might very well end up drawing the conclusion that short-term fitness maximizers are going to or will displace truth seekers in all contexts. I think the games get much more interesting. They also get much harder to create or to write about or coherently, scientifically, because the complexity just goes through the roof. But they get much more interesting when we talk about highly heterogeneous landscape or highly heterogeneous populations or sets of populations that are playing strategies that are also co-evolving, but that have different, let's say, epistemic horizons of what they consider in terms of, like, I like thinking of this as temporal maps, right? So to the extent that, let's say, you and I can agree on the past, the present, and trust each other to create a potential map of the future and get and bring that into fruition, we've established a sort of, you could think of it as like a slice of a spatiotemporal map that extends a four-dimensional time slice, right? We've sort of, the past, we have some level of coherence in terms of our agreement on what the past of that slice looks like, and we have some ability to trust that we can interact with our knowledge of that to produce some future result. And then the question is like, well, what is the resolution of that temporal map, and how long can you extend it into the future and the past? And what's the association between extending it into the past with how far you can extend it into the future, which is like, things like the Lindy question, right? And so there's all of these fascinating questions that come up, and you then get into this, these questions that people like Brett Weinstein talk a lot about when he was responding to Peterson's identification or conflation of truth and fitness with these sort of like what's his particular phrase for it? I'm blanking on it right now, but it's something along the lines of like useful but untrue narratives, right? That can be applied to increase fitness, but don't map directly to, let's say, an empirical ontology. If we're going to restrict that empirical ontology to what can be derived physically in front of in front of you in the here and now, right? So again, it's the question that you ask. I think it's an extremely interesting and necessary question to keep asking, because it forces us to more adequately define the parameters of the conversation. And in so doing, I think we get we increase our adaptive capacity to balance factors of, let's say, truth and fitness. But really, I think it's just, again, it comes down to sacrifice over longer periods of time versus necessity and concentration of it boils down to sacrifice. It boils down to what time horizon is governing your action in the present, right? And like, is it the case that maximizing for a short-term local maxima is going to put you in a place that precludes you from continuing the evolutionary game, right? And I think that's why I am a little bit hesitant to use the word conflation when it comes to the identification of, or the relationship between quote unquote truth and quote unquote fitness, because you can construct the landscape and the agents such that they are non-identified or identified, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So
I know that's a very sort of abstract way of getting to that point, but I think it's absolutely necessary for us to, when we talk about this, really specify the concrete question, the concrete problem in question, and the time horizons over which we're trying to solve for.
Yeah. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the word you were reaching for there was pragmatic truth, but maybe not.
So I think Weinstein has a very specific, there's like a very catchy mimetic way I'm having a hard time. I'm a little cognitively fuzzy right now because it's allergy season here and my first time in this particular location, and the tree pollen is like extremely intense and my sinuses are pounding. So I'm a little fuzzy. My memory's a little, it's not fully there, but pragmatic truth works.
Yeah. Well, anyway, sorry, that was an aside. Well, Matt, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a great conversation. I'm not exactly sure if we've really reached a resolution on these questions, but that creates all the more reason to continue having these kinds of conversations into the future, and I hope that we will at some point. Before I let you go, what have you been thinking about? What have you been working on, and where can people find you?
Sure. So in terms of thinking about and working on a couple things, but we didn't even get into this, but I recently, somewhat recently, over the past few months, purchased some land, and I'm working on taking a lot of the much more abstract worldviews and thoughts I've had and research I've done into complexity and trying to map it onto much more direct processes in terms of management of a local ecology. Also turning that into something that is a productive space in terms of our life, growing food, and all of these different interesting embodied ways of looking at these abstractions and using that as a lens through which to also further the research that I do. Another thing I've been up to is creating, I've been slowly working on and kind of holding in the wings a project I've been working on called Future Aligned, which is a tool that tries to help people align their values, so their sort of long-term transcendent values that they would like to align their life with, and basically map that onto different types of behavioral patterns across different time horizons, like daily, weekly, monthly types of things, and balance all of those tensions, because I think that's a very interesting and complex problem. And how do we actually build that for ourselves bottom up and then stitch it together with our families and communities and in theory, larger aggregates. So that's something I've been working on. And then a lot of mathematical research to increasingly formalize some of my thoughts around emergent systems and try to help create better grammars to talk about these topics. So that's been keeping me quite busy. People can find me currently, mostly I would say just on Twitter, at Matt Pirkowski. I'm going to be I have Medium writings as well, so Matthew Pirkowski on Medium, and then I am going to be creating a decentralized site for myself just to be a little more resilient and move all of my writings there. And I'm going to be doing, I think, a lot more writing over the next year or so in terms of summarizing quite a bit of the research that I've been doing over the past 2 years as I kind of withdrew from the synthesis and went back more to a pure research mode. So yeah, that's where I'm at. Look forward to talking to anybody, and hopefully we can speak again. And I don't think these problems will ever be solved, but perhaps we can make some more progress on them.
Well, thanks so much, Matt. It's been absolutely a pleasure, and see you guys later.